Okay. I'm live on YouTube. Let me get that whiteboard a little closer. Can you pull this little? All right, we're going to get started in a second here. We're just getting live on Instagram, and then we're going to talk about the topic we're going to cover tonight.
Is that good? That view? Or do you want me to back it up?
Move it over this way a little bit. Over this way. You're getting this in it.
I don't see that.
There you go. That's cool.
To write the questions down?
Yeah, if you could, that'd be cool.
Okay, ready?
Yep. Go for it. Everybody, so we're back again Friday night. We're doing our gardening live, checking in on everybody, seeing how your gardens are looking, how your week was. So tonight, what I wanted to talk about was I wanted to cover your soil. We've been getting a lot of questions from people about kind of the soil mix and what we use and how we farm veganically. So tonight, what I wanted to cover was that topic. So we'll go over, our soil mix, all the amendments that we use in our soil mixes. We use different amendments for different mixes. So I'll go through the ratios for each mix we use. And then I want to talk about some of the differences between farming veganically and then farming with animal product. See, traditionally, people have farmed using animal manure for a very long time. And for the last 6 years, we have not used any animal products. So I want to kind of go through the differences between using animal product and not using animal product, and some of the differences in the actual minerals and vitamins that the plants are getting. And then we'll talk a little bit about just the different types of beds and the kind of the ratio for beds. So when you're doing a bed flip, how much amendments do you want to put back into the soil? So we'll cover just some broad topics that have to do with soil. I got the whiteboard out just in case I want to use it again last week when we were going through spacing. So if you missed that one last week, go watch it. It should be up on YouTube, on Instagram, and we covered plant spacing. I'm sure everybody right now is just getting going. Hey, Turn Up with Kelly. How you doing? Hopefully you got your stuff going this week. I'm going to bring up some of the questions that you asked us this week. I think it would be helpful for everybody else in the group to kind of learn from some of your experiences. So if you don't mind, I'm going to talk about those questions you asked me this week a little bit. So yeah, anyway, let me start by just telling you how my week was. So this week we did a lot of bed flipping, still getting stuff in the ground over at the other place. I pulled out all my arugula, so I've got all my arugula here. If you caught the video this week on YouTube, I talked about how you could use your scraps from these beds as you're pulling stuff out of these beds, how you could use those scraps and feed your soil. So that was something that we talked about this week on YouTube. Awesome. So Turnip with Kelly says she's going to be planting tomorrow. That's awesome. You know, get that stuff in the ground as soon as you can. This morning I had a garden consultation, and this was for like a newbie, beginner, asking a lot of basic questions. We recorded it, so I'm gonna take some snippets from that console, and I think it will help a lot of the beginners out there. So I'm gonna put that up on Instagram and YouTube so you guys can all benefit from it. But yeah, anyway, so this week we were just getting a lot of stuff in the beds, pulling stuff out. We had a big grocery order this week, so it kind of wiped me out of arugula. So I had to plant another bed of arugula. I try to plant stuff in succession, so I'll plant plant so much arugula, maybe 10 feet of a 25-foot bed of arugula. Then I'll wait like another week. Then I'll plant another succession on it. Then I'll wait another week and another succession. That way, I have this constant flow of arugula coming in for the store, so there's no gaps. There's no gaps with us selling to the stores. We always have a constant supply of various greens that we can give them each week. The minute you start having gaps is the minute you start losing your shelf spot. So you don't want to have gaps, because if you have gaps with these grocery stores, the big guys will come in and take your spot, and you don't want that. So yeah, I was pulling out a lot of arugula. Today we were over at the house and we were planting some more squash, and we were planting summer squash. I was pulling out radishes, putting turnips in, and kohlrabi, stuff like that. And then I finally got the rest of my irrigation supplies. So next week I'll be doing that. And then today I had a garden consult, which was pretty awesome. It was for a lady in Boston, and she was super like new to gardening. So it was a lot of beginner questions. We recorded that. I'll share it with everybody as I am able to edit it. But she was doing a lot of gardening in grow bags, and she was very limited on space. So she had a little spot in the back of her yard, and then some grow bags in the front. And we went through a lot of the stuff I'm going to cover today. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, because I want. But we heard a lot of the soil stuff. I had a bunch of other soil questions through the week, so I thought put in them and all that good stuff. So let's dive into it. So with my soil mixes, I typically have the same mix that I use across the board, except in my garden beds. So this is the same soil mix that I use for if I'm making soil blocks, if I'm potting up, meaning the stage after the soil blocks, I put it in a 1-gallon pot. I use the same soil mix for that. And then I use it again if I'm doing raised beds or I'm growing in grow bags. So this is great information for people who are getting grow bags or have plastic pots and they want to grow plants in plastic pots or grow bags. So we'll go through that mix as well. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I have going on in my ground beds in the ground. So I'm going to draw up here my my soil mix. So I typically start with coconut coir or peat moss, and that's like my main, or peat moss. The difference between coconut coir is neutral growing medium, meaning the pH is very neutral. It's not acidic like the peat moss. So if I use peat moss, I have to change the pH of the soil to make it neutral. Okay. This is why when I'm growing microgreens, I grow in coconut coir instead of peat moss. Because if I grow microgreens in peat moss, then I have to add limestone to the mix to adjust the pH of the soil. So, uh, but not everybody can get coconut coir. It's us northerners, the people that are further up north, they're not going to have access to coconut coir, but they'll have plenty of access to peat moss. So whatever you can find is fine. They'll work either way. It's just if an extra step, if you get the peat moss, you got to add some limestone. Okay. So this is my first ingredient. My second ingredient is sand. Now, sand is an awesome ingredient. I've done some videos talking about the cosmic energy of sand. Sand is a very important piece to any garden mix. When these commercial growers, these commercial farmers are farming, they're typically farming in sandy, loomy soil. That's the very best soil for growing plants. The sandy, loomy soil, which is a mix of clay, a mix of sand, and a mix of whatever else is on top of that soil. Could be a little peat moss, for those northern growers. But sandy, loomy soil's the best. So what we're trying to do is simulate that soil in an urban environment, right? So we got our cocoa, we got our sand. The next we're going to add is our compost. Now, the compost that we use isn't compost that has any animal product in it whatsoever. Okay. And if you go to your local landscape supply company, you will be able to find compost without animal product. And what you're going to ask for is, can I have compost that doesn't have animal product? And typically it's just broken down leaves, broken down stems, broken down bark that takes like 2 years to break down, and it turns into this real rich, black, nice soil. So the compost is an important piece, and you can find that at your local landscape supply company. If you can't, there's a video that went out this week on Instagram, went out this week on YouTube. And it basically shows the comparison between buying bagged compost versus buying compost in bulk. And that bagged compost is a good alternative. If you can't get your compost from a landscape supply company, you can get it there. Now, let me talk about the problem with compost, okay? The compost that people use that have animal product in it, we got to look at what the animals are being fed. The animal in my mix, and that's fine. You can use azomite, which is one of the rock dusts that I suggested. That will adjust it as well. So it doesn't have to be limestone. Limestone's just nice because it's got some calcium and magnesium in it as well. Helps with your plants growing. So you can get lime. You get from animal product is that you don't know where those animals have been, right? Or what they've been exposed to, or what they've been eating, right? And most of these animals are fed GMO corn, soy, and wheat. Okay. They're being pumped with growth hormones and antibiotics, and they're being exposed to herbicides. Plus, they're being exposed to whatever other farms in their area are spraying chemicals, right? These other farms in these different areas, they're spraying chemicals, and then it gets on the grass that the cows are grazing on. So, or the chickens, or whatever the animal, sheep manure, rabbit manure, all that stuff. So, because of the amount of toxins that these animals are being exposed to, I stay away from the animal product. And I'll tell you a quick story. So when we were, they tell you if you ever have a cut or something like that, not to work with animal manure, because if the cut gets infected from the animal poop, then it could lead to a staph infection, right? So look at the animal manure. It's a toxic thing. Why would we want to put that in our soil? Hey, Mountain Mama, how you doing this evening? Good to see you. So that's one thing. Now the other thing that's really important is, okay, so us as people, we're exposed to all sorts of toxins, right? And then we pass those toxins down to the next generation. Okay. Same thing happens with animals. If that cow, if that cow's grandfather was exposed to or fed the GMO corn, soy, and wheat, exposed to heavy metals, exposed to viruses, all that stuff gets passed down to the next generation of cows, right? So all that stuff gets passed from generation to generation to generation. The reason I say this is because just because the animal is grass fed doesn't mean the previous generations of cows weren't fed the GMO corn, soy, wheat, growth hormones, antibiotics, weren't exposed to the herbicides and all the toxic chemicals. So animal manure I stay away from, because they poop that out, they poop the toxins out, and then the plants, of course, uptake that, which we want to avoid. So that's why it's important to get compost that doesn't have animal product in it. And a lot of the compost you get in the box stores, it's all toxic stuff. It all comes from like big ag that are feeding these animals all sorts of crap. So you don't want that stuff. You want to make your own soil mix. Then you know exactly what is in that mix. There's no questions, right? So the next thing that you're going to use is soil from the land. Okay, so soil from the land. Now, say you're in an area where you can't get the soil. You live in an apartment and you don't have access to any soil because you're in an apartment. Um, that's so yeah. So the soil, if you can't get soil on the land, just you're going to double up the compost, meaning you'll double the amount of compost. Now we'll go through just all of the ratios that I use in my mix. Now I mix everything in a half wine barrel. You can mix it in like a wheelbarrow, something like that. Typically, what I do is I take a 5-gallon bucket. You can get those 5-gallon buckets at most hardware stores, and that's what I use for my ratios. So the first thing here is I'm going to use two 5-gallon buckets of coconut coir or peat moss. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is sand. I'm going to use one bucket of sand. I'm going to use one bucket of compost and one bucket of soil from the land, and that's my mix. And that's my mix. So this is what I use for like all my raised beds. This is what I use for my soil blocks. I use this for my little 1-gallon pots when I pot stuff up. I use this for grow bags. So this would be a good mix for those of you that want to grow stuff in grow bags. This is the mix you should go with. Now, remember what I said, if you don't have the soil from the land, just double the compost amount, okay? So now I want to now let's say I have a crop that likes well-drained soil, okay? So like peppers, for example, love well-drained soil. Potatoes like well-drained soil. So if you're growing something like that, you might switch this mix up a little bit. And what I mean by that is, rather than putting the 2 buckets of coconut coir or peat, do 2 buckets of sand instead. And that would be a good mix for anything that likes well-drained soil. Okay, question from Rocky Mountain Mama. What about hydroponic planting? So hydroponics a little bit different. That's using water instead of soil. I can't say I've done much hydroponics. There was a guy up where we farmed. He did hydroponic lettuce, and I saw his setup. Basically, with hydroponics, rather than doing it in the soil, you're doing it in the water, and then you're buying liquid amendments, and that's how you're feeding your plants, is through these liquid amendments. After reading Rudolf Steiner's book, The Biodynamic Farming, it's very important to grow stuff in the ground because there's energy that surrounds us here on this earth, and there's energy that comes from the ground. So something about growing in the soil that's better for the plant. So I don't really do the hydroponic thing. Never have. I don't think I will unless it gets into one of those situations where it's like, you can't grow anything outside because the outside is so toxic from radiation or metals or something like that. Then you'd have to grow inside. And if you had to grow inside, then hydroponically would be a good option. But hydroponics, that's what a lot of the strawberries you get in the grocery stores, they're grown hydroponically. A lot of the lettuce you get in the grocery stores, like the living lettuce, that's all grown hydroponically. So I think you get more minerals and vitamins and nutrients from crops that are grown in the ground. I think that's how plants are meant to be grown, is in the ground. So, yeah. All right, so this is my soil mix for everything I just listed off. So this was what I would use for grow bags. This is what I would use for pots. This is what I would use for soil blocks. This is what I would use for raised beds. Now, I'm going to erase this, and I'm going to show you what I would do in a situation where so now what we're going to do is I want to talk about amendments. Okay, so amendments. Windy, I know. Yeah, so if you want to read it, for some reason, Instagram, when I write stuff, it shows up backwards. But if you go on our YouTube on that gardening channel, it actually reads out correctly. So if you want to replay this or you want to watch it live, go on our YouTube, that gardening channel, and you'll be able to read everything that I'm putting up here. If you don't care about that, you just want to hear what I have to say, then no need to do that. Yeah, totally. There's hydroponic planting in high schools. Yeah, there's a lot of that going on here in the Bay Area. There's a big hydroponic operation in Half Moon Bay, and they grow hydroponics, and they have fish that grow underneath all the plants, and then the fish eat the algae, and then the people eat the fish. So there's a lot of that stuff going on. So all right, so we just went through that soil mix, right? And now what I want to talk about is the amendments. Okay, because I use different amendments for different things that I'm different mixes. Okay, so for soil blocks, I typically, what I'll use for that is the least amount of amendments. Okay, so the soil blocks, I'll do earthworm castings. So earthworm castings, alfalfa, I do kelp and then biochar. And then some other ones you can put. These are just kind of optional things. They're veganic, so you could use these if you wanted to. And there's no sort of toxic stuff in it. Would be the insect frass, langenbite, rock phosphate, and green sand, and humic acid. So, all right, so we got everything up here. I'm just going to kind of go through each one and tell you why I use it. So, earthworm castings is a really important piece in my mix. I probably put the most of the earthworm and the alfalfa in my mix. The earthworm castings, what I've noticed, they are made out of supercharged organic matter, right? When earthworms live under the soil, what they're doing under the soil is they're moving around and they're pooping. And then the poop that comes from under the soil then feeds the plants through the root system. And that happens with a lot of the life that lives under the soil. So earthworm castings are like a supercharged version. There's beneficial microbes added to the earthworm digestive process. It also has some nitrogen in it. So earthworm castings, that's like one of my top things that I use. Then you have alfalfa meal. So alfalfa, you're getting a little nitrogen. Earthworm, you're getting a little nitrogen. But with alfalfa, you're also getting the phosphorus, and then you're getting the potassium. Everything in this. The NPK on alfalfa is 2.5 of nitrogen. You're getting 0.5 of phosphorus, and then you're getting another 2.5 of potassium. So all around, alfalfa is a really good amendment to have in your soil mix. Okay. So I do a lot of the alfalfa, and I'm missing one on here. Next one is neem seed. Neem seed meal, kelp, azomite, biochar. Okay, so neem seed meal. So neem seed meal has a ton of nitrogen in it. Now, with plants, how nitrogen works in the process is the more nitrogen you can get into the soil, the more the plants are going to grow. So if your plants aren't growing and you're wondering, well, why aren't they growing? It could be because you don't have enough nitrogen in the soil for the plant to grow. Okay, so alfalfa is a good one for that, but so is neem seed meal. It's 6 in nitrogen, 1 in phosphorus, and then a 2 in potassium, right? So the stuff with nitrogen you want a lot of if you want your plants to grow. So with these 3 things, I put the most of these 3 things in my mix. Then you have kelp, right? So with kelp, there's a lot of micronutrients within kelp, but we know kelp is a good thing, right? And what's happening right now is they're bombarding our soils with all sort of toxic stuff falling from the sky. And what we know, what removes heavy metals in our bodies. So what do you think the kelp is doing in the soil? So kelp is a good one because of the micronutrients, but it also has a 0.1, and a 2. Okay, so you're getting some nitrogen, you're getting a small amount of phosphorus, and then a good amount of potassium. And then azomite is a rock dust. But you can use any rock dust. It doesn't have to be azomite. I just have azomite available in my area, so that's what I use. But I've also used glacial rock dust. I've used limestone. You can use rock phosphate, which is one of the optional amendments here at the bottom. And then the last thing I use is biochar. And biochar, I pretty much use biochar for its holding abilities. Meaning, with certain amendments, when you water those amendments, the amendments get leached out of the soil. So to help avoid those amendments getting leached from the soil, you have biochar. So biochar will actually hold on to those amendments and make them last longer in your garden beds, right? So this is my mix that I pretty much put in every single soil mix that I do. So with soil blocks, what I do with my soil blocks is I put I put two cups of earthworm castings. I put 1 1/2 cup of alfalfa. I put 1 cup of neem seed, 1 cup of kelp, 1/2 cup of azomite, and then I put 1/2 cup of biochar. So that's my soil block mix. And I've done a video on this, so you can find a video explaining everything that goes in here. But the reason that I don't put a whole lot of amendments in that mix is because the plant is only going to be in that soil block for a small period of time. It's not going to be in that soil block the whole growing season. It's only going to be in there for maybe a couple weeks once it pops up before you then pot it up, which is kind of that next step. Or instead of potting it up, you could just transplant it directly in your garden. So with the soil block stage, you don't need that many amendments because there's no long-term growth going on here. If there was long-term growth going on, you would want to add more amendments, right? Which leads me to the next thing, which is the potting up. So when I pot stuff up, so when I'm potting stuff up, my mix now changes. And the reason it changes is because now we've gone from the soil block stage to that stage of it sitting in a 1-gallon pot for an extended period of time before it goes in the ground. And like I said in the video, I only do this with certain crops. So it's really a lot of this stuff that I want to get a head start on the season on. So I do it with a lot of I do it with like tomatoes, I do it with peppers, I do it with eggplant, winter squash, summer squash. You can do it with melon, but you can really do it with any plant. You know, you can move it into a pot if you wanted to. If I have tomatoes in one bed and I want to get a fall crop of broccoli in there, I might put the broccoli starts in 1-gallon containers until my tomatoes have ended for the season. That way my broccoli can get a head start. And when the broccoli is ready to go in the ground, it's already a good size. So it's broccoli. So that's another way you can use it. But potting up, so then I do 3 cups. I do 3 cups of alfalfa. I do 2 cups of neem, 1 1/2 cup of kelp. And then azomite, I do 1 1/2, and then 1 cup biochar. So that's my mix when I pot stuff up, which is the same soil mix we just talked about in the beginning, but I just switched the amendments because I want the plant to grow, right? The soil itself it has some minerals and some vitamins in it, but once you add this stuff, then you really start to get the growth out of the plant. So this is a good way to like supercharge your plants to sustain long-term growth. And all this stuff is it's in a meal form. It's kelp meal, it's neem seed meal, alfalfa meal, because because it's in a meal form, you're not going to get instant growth. It's going to be more of a long-term growth. It's a slow release of minerals and vitamins. It's not an instant release of minerals and vitamins. And I just want to grab something that's relevant to the conversation. Okay, so if you want like instant growth, you could use liquid amendments. And all you do with this is you get your liquid amendments, you put this in something like a backpack sprayer, something you can spray these amendments on your crops. You dilute it. You don't want to just put this stuff directly in your sprayer and then start spraying it. It would be too much on the crop. So you dilute this with some water. So this is one I use. It's just a regular 4 for nitrogen, 3 for potassium, phosphorus, and then 3 for potassium. So this is kind of my base that I use, but then I also add in, the ocean magic, which is just a bunch of different types of seaweed. Then I also add in, this is mainly kelp, but this is veganic. It's called earth juice. It's got all plant-based stuff in there. And then most plants, they need calcium and magnesium. This is one thing that most plants need. It's not all about just your nitrogen, your potassium, and your phosphorus. Your plants also need calcium and magnesium. This is one way that I get the calcium and magnesium. Another way that I get it is using Epsom salt. Epsom salt is great for if you want your plants to take in some magnesium and some calcium. And you'll notice deficiencies in your plants when your leaves start to turn yellow, or your plants when they start fruiting. You might get blossom end rot on the end of your plants. It's usually a deficiency. Could be calcium, could be magnesium. So I always keep this on hand and feed it to certain crops. Peppers love Epsom salt, so do a lot of the squashes. I'll put it on the tomatoes. It's a lot of the summer crops. I don't use it with my greens or anything like that. Then the last one is just kelp. So I just, I put some more kelp in there. And what I do is I mix that and I make a compost tea. So then I have a bubbler. I put all the ingredients in a bucket with an aquarium bubbler, and then it bubbles everything. I let that bubble for 24 hours. Then I put it in a backpack sprayer, and then I spray it all over my plants. So this is a way to get instant amendments, where this is a way to get long-term amendments. The Epsom salt brand. The question is what Epsom salt do you use? I just got this. It's Omri certified. That's the brand I use. You want to get plant Epsom salt. Don't buy like Epsom salt at the store and try to put that on your plants. This is made by Monterey is the company, but this is made in Fresno, so you might find something more local to your area. Just go to a nursery or a hydroponics store. That's where I get all my stuff. And I'll do a video on how to make a compost tea. One that is going to come. I'm going to do a whole live talking about how to fertilize all your crops. And when I talk about how to fertilize them, then I'm going to bring in my compost tea maker and show everybody how to make a good compost tea. So that will be coming. We're not quite there. Everything is just getting put in the ground at this point. I won't start fertilizing everything probably till next month or end of June. Okay, so we talked about the potting up mix. This is my next mix, okay? Now, the next mix I make is the mix that I would use for your raised beds and your grow bags. This is going to be a long-term mix. So if you're planting stuff in these grow bags, raised beds, and they're going to be in there for an extended period of time, and they need to be fertilized over that period of time, this is a good mix for that. Now, like I said, I mix everything. Question from Turn Up with Kelly: is there a difference in the growing rate with the liquid? Yeah, they have on these containers. They tell you the rate, like how many tablespoons you're supposed to put in, and then how much water you're supposed to dilute it with. So all I do is follow the instructions on here. Just to give you an example off one of these, they actually say the strength. So like this one says, if you want it extra strong, you do 6 teaspoons per gallon. If you want it just strong, 3 teaspoons per gallon. If you want it medium, 2 teaspoons, and then mild, 1 teaspoon. So it just depends on the crop that you're growing, right? If you're growing a heavy feeding crop, you're going to want to put more of the liquid amendment into the bubbler. So it just depends on what you're growing, right? But what I do is I kind of keep it simple. I follow the strong recommendation on here, and I do that across the board with all my liquids. And Turn Up with Kelly, if you message me on Instagram, I'll give you the ratio, and I'll try to post it in the description on the YouTube. I'll try to post it in the description page there so everybody has access to everything that we use. But back to talking about the raised beds in the grow bags. Okay, yeah. So do plants grow faster with liquid fertilizer as opposed to the long term? Correct. Yes, because this is in a meal form, right? So because it's in a meal form, it's a slow release. So every time you water, those amendments are then being released into the root system of the plant, and the roots are uptaking those minerals and those vitamins. Where if you spray this down at the roots of the plant, it's an instant thing. They're uptaking those minerals instantly. So there is a difference between the two. You could use the liquids if you want your plants to grow faster. But with the mix I'm going to give you next, you don't even have to use these liquid amendments, and your plants will grow just fine. This is just another option to get stuff growing a little quicker, right? So yeah, 2 options, and I'll talk more about the liquid stuff later. But this is going to be my mix for like grow bags or like raised beds. Okay, so earthworm castings, I put 6 cups in. Alfalfa, I do 6. Neem seed, I do 4. Kelp meal, I do 3. Azomite, I do 2. Biochar, I do 1. And that's my mix. This is my mix that I use when I flip a bed. So when I flip a bed, my bed is 30 inches. The largest bed is 25 feet. So I would use this same mix when I flip a bed, meaning when I flip a bed, I add compost, add new amendments. I don't add all that other stuff I just talked about in the beginning. I only add that stuff if it's bed for like a raised bed or grow bags or pots, something like that, that's the mix I use. But in all my beds out in the garden, I uh, I have those beds are already mixed, so I don't need to add any of those other things. The only thing I need to add is more compost because that's going to help with the growth of the plants, and then add the amendments. And that's all I do when I flip a bed: compost and amendments, and that's it. And so this is the recipe I use for a 25-foot bed. Now, say you were doing a 50-foot bed, I would double this. So if you're doing a 50-foot bed, I would use double the amount that I just wrote on this board here. Okay. So that kind of covers like, um, the grow bag and the raised bed question. Now, if you're just doing like a couple grow bags, you're not going to use this recipe. This recipe is made if you're doing maybe like 16 grow bags. This is enough for 16 grow bags, right? So, I use this same mix for a 25-foot bed. So, if you're doing like one or two grow bags, you're not going to use this same mix. This same mix is really meant for someone that is doing a lot of grow bags. And like I said, I mix this in a half wine barrel. And you saw how much soil I put in there in my mix. So when I make that mix, I can make it enough for, 14 to 18 grow bags. So this mix is meant for if you're doing something like that. Now, if you're not, and you're just doing a couple bags, that's cool too. Just do a couple bags. You'll just have soil left over. No big deal. So I hope that kind of gives you an idea of like the different when I use different amounts of amendments in different mixes, because I think there was a lot of questions this week about how much amendments to add in different mixtures, and it's important to kind of understand that, because I don't just use, if I'm making soil blocks, I wouldn't use that same soil block recipe if I'm doing raised beds or grow bags, because I would not have enough amendments in there to sustain a long growth period for the plants. Too much for 6 or 10 gallon grow bags. No. If you're doing 6 grow bags, that's cool. You're just going to have leftover soil. That's all I'm saying is you're making a mix for like 14 bags. But if you only use 6 grow bags, then you're just going to have half of that soil left over. Right. So what I'm saying is I'll use all that soil in about 14 to 18 grow bags. But if you're not using 14 to 18 grow bags, that's cool. You're just going to have a bunch of soil left over from the mix. So no big deal. Okay, and then there's some stuff in the bottom here, and this is stuff you can use. They're still considered veganic. I just really stick to this because it's affordable. When you start getting into some of these other things, they start to get a little expensive. Green sand is a good one if you want to get some more potassium. That's a good one for potassium. Rock phosphate is another good one if you want phosphorus. Now, it's important to understand that these amendments, they leach out of the soil. You're watering the soil, it rains, that stuff leaches out of the soil. This is why I use biochar, because it holds the minerals in the soil for a longer period of time than if you were to not use it. But the stuff leaches out. So your nitrogen leaches out in your potassium. Your phosphorus will typically stay in your soil for about 2 years. So the phosphorus, you don't have to put phosphorus in the soil every single year or every single bed flip, because it's most likely still in there. But you do need to continue to put nitrogen in there for plant growth, and then potassium in there as well. So those are two things you really want to keep adding to those beds. Okay. Yeah, so green sand is a good one. Rock phosphate is a good one that I use. Um, Langenmite is a good one for potassium. It's got a lot of potassium in it, so that would be a good one. But this is a slow release, very slow release. So this I would only use like if it's a long-term bed, like if you're putting it in a bed that you're gonna be growing stuff for a long period of time in that bed, because it takes a long period for this to fully break down. Um, but yeah, so that's what I do with all my different mixes. Okay. So, is there any questions on any of this stuff? Do you guys have questions on any of the amendments that I'm using? Do you have questions on getting your soils going? Because you need soil to grow food, right? So without good soil, your plant's not going to do much. But if you have good soil, that plant is going to do awesome. Something I said today on my garden coaching, it can be overwhelming when you're having to get all these ingredients and you've never gardened before. Very overwhelming. You could you could think of getting these agreements and putting this recipe together just like you do when you are in your kitchen and you're putting together a food recipe, right? When you're putting together a food recipe, you don't have all the ingredients all the time, so you have to go get those ingredients, bring them back to the kitchen, and then put them all together. But just like cooking a recipe for the first time, you don't know how it's going to turn out. You don't know if it's going to be good or if it's going to be bad. So don't get discouraged by the idea of having to get all this stuff and then make your own soil. Think of it like once you do it one time, once you get it down, you have the recipe forever, and you just continue to replicate that recipe every time you need soil. But this is why it's so important to get your own, be able to make your own soil, because you don't want to rely on the crap you get get in the stores. It's toxic stuff. So just like most of us on medical medium, we're used to having to spend more time in the kitchen. This is just you spending a little more time in the garden. Okay, so I have some questions here from this week. So Ashley put the questions on Instagram, and we had some questions this week. So I wanted to just go through the questions, and then leave it up to you guys if you have more questions than what's being asked here. So, what exactly should I buy from the landscape supply company to replace bags of compost? Um, to replace bags of compost. Yeah, so at the landscape supply company, you're going to want to get the compost that doesn't have any animal products. So what I do is I call around to the different landscape supply companies before I go down there, and I say, "Do you have soil that is animal product free? There's no animal manure." And then someone will say yes, someone will say no. The ones that say no, X them off your list and try to find it. Now, if you can't find it, there is an alternative. There is, if you watch the video we posted this week on Instagram, it's up on that gardening channel where I'm comparing bagged compost versus buying in bulk. Now, if you can't get the stuff in bulk, buy it in a bag. That's cool too. You're just going to get a way better deal if you can buy it at a landscape supply company for a cheaper cost. Um, so that's what I do whenever I get my compost. Now, you can make your own compost too. And if you guys are doing medical medium, you have a ton of food scraps. We dump all our food scraps in a compost bin. We compost it, and then every year to a year and a half, we're able to use that compost, put it back into the soil, and that stuff is more rich than the stuff I'm getting at the landscape supply company. So Don't rely on the landscape supply company, rely on yourself. Because if there was a situation where that landscape supply company wasn't around, or if there were shortages on compost, or you just couldn't get it, you want to have compost on hand at the house that you can use. And what I'll typically use is I'll use a lot of my fruit scraps in the compost bin, and then a lot of my green scraps like my celery pulp, cucumber pulp, stuff like that. I'll just lay those over the top of my garden beds because it's not going to attract any animals. The only stuff that will attract animals is like your fruit scraps and stuff that's sweet. So, um, something to keep in mind. But difference between topsoil, compost, I'm a newbie, and when to use it. Okay, so topsoil is basically just the top layer of the soil. So, like a bulldozer or a backhoe would just go in and scrape the top layer of the soil. Um, so that soil is like the soil in an open field. You don't know what minerals, what vitamins, what's actually in that soil. It's just topsoil. Could have a lot of weeds, weed seeds in it. You could bring it back to your house and introduce all these new weeds to your garden, which wouldn't be a good thing. So the compost is different because the compost is actually scraps broken down that have turned into soil. So compost has to have heat, and when you get the heat of the compost, it actually kills off a lot of the weed seeds and stuff like that might be introduced to that compost mix. But compost is basically just broken down material. When people use animal manure, they let the animal manure break down for a year to 2 years before it turns into soil. When you're composting, it's not just the food scraps, it's not just the fruit scraps, you have to add green waste to it, yard waste to it too. So, like, here's all my arugula scraps from when I cut out all my arugula this week. This arugula can then either be laid back on your soil beds, the heavy, the video I did this week, this is what I did, or this can go in your compost. And you need scraps, yard scraps in your compost. Everything works in combination. I even throw sand in my compost bin. I'll throw dirt in my compost bin. Whatever it takes to supercharge that soil, right? If you put dirt in there and sand in there, that's some ingredients already in your mix. Perfect, right? You got sand, you got compost in there or dirt. It's going to break everything down quicker. So, you have to add other things. If your compost gets really smelly, that means you don't have enough of the yard waste in the compost bin. So, like your brown leaves, your stems, your barks, stuff like that. You don't have enough of that in your compost bin. Okay. Um, and then the last question is how to keep bugs off of kale. So this was something that we ran into when we were up farming. We come like end of July, we had a bunch of kale planted, and it just got infested with aphids. Um, Now there are ways to get those aphids off. They're very tedious. They like you could pick off all the leaves that the aphids are on, and that would get rid of the aphids. But aphids could come back. Um, so what I do is I have a second crop ready of kale. So I know that aphids are going to come around at the end of July, beginning of August in my area. Could be different in other areas. So I have a second crop of kale ready to go in the ground. So when that stuff starts getting infested with aphids, I just cut it out and pull it out of the bed. The other alternative is you can buy ladybugs. Ladybugs eat aphids. So you can buy ladybugs. You can put row covers over your um, over your crops. So there's different types of row covers. There's there there's different heat levels, right? So you could get a really heavy duty cloth, which would keep more heat in, or you can get a really light duty cloth, which will keep more heat out. It doesn't really matter. All you're using it for is to keep the ladybugs in the tunnel, right? If you just release ladybugs on your aphids, they're just going to fly all over the place. They're not going to do the job. They're not going to take care of those kale. So what I would do is cover that bed up first, that bed of kale, release the aphids. The aphids will then go to work on, or release the ladybugs, which will go to work on the aphids, and that should take care of your aphid problem. That is the best solution, is doing something like that. It's more natural, right? There's all sorts of synthetic chemicals, regular chemicals that can be used to kill the aphids, but then you've got chemicals on your food, and you don't want that, right? You want to grow organically, and even though something says organic on the label, it can still contain synthetic chemicals, right? And this is a big thing in the organic food industry, because you could be buying organic food thinking it's organic. Well, it's not organic because they're using synthetics, because the organic program allows you to use synthetic chemicals, because the chemicals break down and supposedly leave the soil after a year or two. So a lot of farms will use these synthetic chemicals. A lot of these synthetics and non-synthetics, just regular like sprays, contain a lot of nicotine in it, and we learned that from Anthony, that there's a lot of nicotine in a lot of these sprays that they use to repel different insects. So we try to do everything organic, have a backup of everything. So if you lose something to disease, fungus, if you lose it to insects, you've got backup plants you can put in its place. Um, and that's the importance of just always having stuff ready to go in the ground. So if something fails, you can put something new in the ground. So yeah, and that was kind of it. So I had some stuff. There were some questions this week that came up from Turn Up with Kelly. She had asked us a bunch of questions that were related to some of the stuff we talked about today. But I'm going to use her experience as something to talk about here, because she doesn't have a truck, right? So that could be something that might be stopping you from getting a bunch of soil or going to a landscape supply company. You see, I have a truck. Well, it's easy if you have a truck, right? But you go to these landscape supply companies and they'll have bags, and they'll fill up these bags for you of this stuff. So just buy a bunch of bags of compost and sand. And if they have peat moss, buy a big block of peat moss or a cocoa block. This is what the cocoa blocks look like. They look like this. You get them in a block. They're small. This could fit in anybody's car, right? You get home, you add water to it, and then it expands. So the peat moss and cocoa shouldn't be a problem, but the landscape supply company should have bags. They'll even help you fill up the bags. They'll help you get them in the car so you can then get them home, right? So if you're trying to get this stuff and then you're trying to take it home and maybe it's too heavy, what I suggested was do like 10 loads if it takes you 10 loads, Turn Up with Kelly. So she's saying she took her grow bags to the landscape supply company and they gladly filled them up. That's a alternative as well. So you could just take your bags there and just have them mix it for you right then and there, and then your mix is set, and all you have to do is add your amendments. See Shelley Travel, soil plus compost plus sand plus peat moss or cocoa block. So soil, compost, sand, peat moss, or cocoa, whichever you can find, right? If you're a northerner, you might not have the access to the cocoa, but you might have a ton of peat moss because the peat moss comes from Canada. So if you have the peat moss, you just add the limestone. if you watch the beginning, like go back and watch the beginning of this live, on the board here I wrote down my mix I use. It's basically two 5-gallon buckets of peat moss or cocoa, 1 bucket of sand, 1 bucket of compost, and then 1 bucket of soil. And that's my base mix that I use for pretty much everything but my garden beds that are in the ground. Um, but that will give you kind of a good idea. But yeah, so don't get discouraged when these landscape supply companies, you think you have to have a truck to do this. You don't. You can bring some bags. They'll fill them up for you. They most likely have bags there, so you could take these bags, get them home. If you can't lift the bag out of the car, cut the bag open. Just fill 5-gallon buckets up of the bag and take it one bag at a time. Don't think don't let these obstacles take you away from your ability to grow stuff, because right now it's important to just get stuff in the ground. Once you get stuff in the ground, then you just have to sit back and water it and give it amendments and let it grow. But if you let these little things discourage you from actually growing food, when are you going to ever learn to grow food, right? Like, now is the time. Right now is the time to grow food. If what Anthony is telling us about these food shortages, if that is going down, we need to be able to grow our own food. And you learn stuff every year you grow food. Okay, so maybe this year it sucks, and you can't get stuff growing and you're still learning, and that's okay, because you're going to make mistakes. You're going to learn from those mistakes, and then every year you're going to get better. And this is how we improve as gardeners. Nothing is going to be perfect the first time you do it. You have to learn from your mistakes and get better. So the more of this learning that can transpire before these shortages happen, the better prepared you are when the time comes, right? So turn up with Kelly. Love all these tips. I'm learning so much. Thank you for taking the time to teach us, Ben. No problem. I'm happy to do it. It's so different, right? Growing without animal product. It's just completely different, and there's not a lot of people talking about this, and there's not a lot of people growing like this. So it's something very new that not a whole lot of people know about and know how to grow like this. So especially in the medical medium community, there's so many people that we eat all of this wonderful food all the time. Why not grow it, right? And why not grow it the healthiest way we can, free of all those toxic chemicals and all that crap that gets put in our soil. So happy to do it. So next week we're going to be doing this again next Friday. I haven't figured out the topic for next week yet. Maybe I'll make some compost tea. If you guys would like that, let me know. Maybe I'll do a compost tea, and I'll show you how I make a compost tea here. I think that'd be cool, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about fertilizing your crops. I don't know yet. I'm still. It depends on what kind of questions I get this week. That's kind of how I decide what I'm going to talk about. So we'll see. Stay tuned, though. I'll have another video coming out this week, and then we have another video with Josh Aldridge. Josh is going to be his second video. He's going to be talking about trendy, all the trends that he tried before he found medical medium. I mean, this guy did every trend you could think of. Apple cider vinegar. He was doing keto. He was doing bone broth soup. Fermented foods. Everything you're not supposed to be doing, Josh did before he eventually came to medical medium. So this next video on that Root Life channel, our YouTube channel, is going to be with Josh, and he's going to be talking about those trendy traps. And then the gardening video this week, it's going to be a good one. Stay tuned and look for that this week. Otherwise, have a good weekend, and get out in your gardens and start growing some food. All right. We'll see ya. Bye.